Back in my day, we didn't mix with people like him. The racist grandpa scoffed. He thought his grandson's black friend was beneath him, just another nobody. But when he found out who the boy's father was, his face went pale, his hands trembled, and you will be shocked by what happened next. The sun cast golden streaks over the quiet suburban neighborhood, a picture-perfect setting of tree-lined streets and freshly mowed lawns. Inside a modest, well-kept home, 12-year-old Ethan sat at the dining table, eagerly finishing his homework. His best friend, Malik, sat beside him, the two boys laughing as they quizzed each other on math problems. "Dude, you're terrible at fractions," Malik teased, nudging Ethan playfully. "Whatever, man. I'm just saving my brain power for something important," Ethan shot back with a grin. Their laughter was light-hearted, pure, like the bond they shared. But the warmth in the room evaporated when the front door creaked open. In walked Grandpa Henry, a man whose face was carved with deep lines, each one telling a story of years gone by. His steel-grey eyes surveyed the scene before him, but the moment they landed on Malik, they darkened with something colder. His lips curled. "Who's this?" His voice carried a sharp edge. Ethan beamed. "Grandpa, this is Malik. My best friend." Henry's gaze flickered over Malik, scanning him like one might inspect a piece of spoiled fruit. "You didn't tell me your best friend was like him." Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Malik's face fell, his natural confidence dimming as he picked up on the hostility. Ethan's mom, Claire, emerged from the kitchen, her jaw tightening. "Dad," she said sharply, a warning in her tone. But Henry ignored her, his eyes never leaving Malik. "Back in my day, we didn't mix with people like him," he muttered. "We knew our place." The words landed like a slap. Ethan's stomach knotted. "Grandpa, what does that mean?" Claire stepped forward, her protective instincts flaring. "Malik is Ethan's friend, Dad. A good kid. And you will show him respect." Henry scoffed, shaking his head as he settled into his chair. "You can call it whatever you want. I call it the way the world used to be." Malik shifted uncomfortably, his fingers gripping the edge of his chair. "Ethan, maybe I should go." "No," Ethan interrupted, his voice firmer than usual. "You're not going anywhere." Henry let out a low chuckle, leaning back. "Suit yourself, boy. Just don't be surprised when the world teaches you where you really belong." Claire's face burned with anger, but before she could speak, Malik stood up. "You don't know me," he said quietly. "You don't know anything about me, or where I belong." Henry smirked. "I know enough." Ethan clenched his fists. "You're wrong, Grandpa. And one day you'll see." But Henry just laughed, as if Ethan's words were nothing more than childish foolishness. Little did he know, the day he would eat those words was coming faster than he could ever imagine. And when the truth hit him, it would shake him to his core. The atmosphere in the house felt thick, like the weight of Henry's words had settled into the walls, poisoning the air. Malik tried to brush it off, but Ethan could see the way his friend's shoulders tensed, how his usual bright energy had dulled. Ethan's mother, Claire, shot her father a glare so sharp it could cut glass. "Dad, we have talked about this. I will not allow that kind of talk in my home." Henry shrugged, completely unmoved. "I'm just saying what no one else wants to admit." He turned his gaze back to Malik. "Your folks never taught you respect, huh? Walking into someone's home like you belong here?" Malik inhaled sharply, his fingers clenching into fists at his sides. He was used to subtle racism, the kind that came in tight smiles and dismissive glances. But this was different. This was blunt. "Ugly." Claire's voice trembled with controlled fury. "Malik, honey, you don't have to listen to this." But Malik didn't back down. He lifted his chin, his voice steady despite the fire burning behind his eyes. "My parents taught me plenty. They taught me to be proud of who I am, and they taught me that people like you are stuck in the past." Henry's smirk faltered for the briefest second before he scoffed. "Pride, huh? That's rich." He turned to Ethan. "You think this is your best friend? Wait until the real world teaches you a lesson, boy. You'll see how different we really are." Ethan felt his face heat up with anger. His grandpa's words weren't just insulting, they were wrong. He had never seen Malik as anything but his best friend. his brother, in everything but blood. "Grandpa, stop!" Ethan snapped. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with frustration. "Malik is better than you think, a better person than you'll ever be." Henry let out a dry chuckle. "Is that right? And what does his daddy do? Some low-wage job? Working for people like me?" A tense silence filled the room. Malik's expression remained unreadable, but his eyes darkened. Ethan saw it, the shift in his friend's face, like he knew something no one else in the room did. And then, Malik smiled. It wasn't forced or bitter. It was the kind of smile that meant, "You have no idea what's coming." "My dad," Malik said slowly, his voice calm, measured. "Oh, he does all right for himself." Ethan caught the flicker of amusement in Malik's gaze. Henry scoffed, waving him off. "Kid, sure he does." Ethan had seen that look before. Malik wasn't just unfazed. He was waiting for something. And Ethan had the strangest feeling that when his grandpa finally found out who Malik's father was, it would change everything. The tension lingered long after Henry's scoffing words faded into silence. Claire was still glaring at her father, her lips pressed into a thin, furious line. Ethan, though still fuming, turned to Malik, who seemed oddly calm, almost like he was amused by the situation. That's when Malik did something that caught everyone off guard. He smirked. "You know what, Ethan? We should hang out at my place next time. Maybe bring your grandpa along." Ethan blinked. "What?" Henry let out a dry laugh. "Your place? What, your folks live in some run-down part of town?" Claire's mouth dropped open. "Dad, enough." But Malik only chuckled, completely unfazed. "Nah, we live in a nice neighborhood. Pretty big house. You might have heard of it." Henry scoffed. "Oh yeah? And what, your dad is some big-shot doctor or lawyer?" He said it mockingly, as if the thought was ridiculous. Malik's smile didn't waver. Something like that. Ethan, now intrigued, turned to his best friend. "Wait, what does your dad do?" Malik stretched his arms casually, taking his time before answering. "He owns a few businesses, works with a lot of important people." He then locked eyes with Henry. "I think you'd love to meet him." There was something in the way he said it. He knew something Henry didn't. And Ethan wasn't the only one who noticed. Claire's expression softened, as if she'd suddenly realized something. Henry, however, remained skeptical. "Ha, what, is he some local shop owner or something?" Malik just smiled. "You'll see." Ethan didn't know why, but his stomach twisted with anticipation. Something told him that when his grandpa did meet Malik's dad, it would be a moment he would never forget. The following Saturday, Ethan and Henry drove to Malik's house. Henry had scoffed at the idea, but curiosity had gotten the better of him. In his mind, this was just another lesson for Ethan, another chance to prove that Malik was nothing special, that people like him didn't belong in certain circles. But the moment they turned onto Malik's street, Henry's smirk faded. The neighborhood was nothing like he expected. Grand, towering houses lined the road, each more impressive than the last. Manicured lawns stretched in every direction. Luxury cars sat gleaming in driveways, and the air of wealth was undeniable. Ethan's eyes widened. "Whoa, this is your neighborhood." Henry's fingers clenched the steering wheel tighter, his brows furrowed in confusion. "This can't be right," he muttered. "No way." But as they pulled up to Malik's house, a mansion, really, his face paled. The house was enormous, sleek and modern, with sprawling glass windows and a gate that opened automatically as they approached. Henry swallowed hard. This didn't make sense. Ethan nudged him. "Grandpa, you okay?" Henry didn't answer. His mind was racing. As they stepped out of the car, Malik stood at the front door, grinning. "Hey, glad you could make it." Ethan rushed up, still in awe. "Dude, this place is insane." But Henry barely heard him. His attention had shifted to the sleek black car pulling into the driveway. An expensive model he knew cost more than most people's houses. The car door opened, and out stepped a tall, broad-shouldered man in an expensive suit. His presence was commanding, his stride confident. Then Henry saw his face, and everything stopped. His breath hitched, his hands trembled. Because standing before him, shaking Malik's hand, was a man he recognized, a man he had seen on TV, a man whose name carried weight in powerful circles, a billionaire, a household name. Henry's throat went dry. His voice barely came out. "That's your father?" Malik smiled. "Yep. Grandpa Henry, meet my dad." Henry's knees nearly buckled. The man standing before him wasn't just rich. He wasn't just successful. He was one of the most powerful black businessmen in the country, and Henry had just mocked his son. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He had spent his whole life believing that people like Malik weren't his equals, that they had their place, that they could never be on the same level as men like him. But now, standing before this man, a man far more powerful, influential, and successful than Henry had ever been, he felt small. For the first time in his life, Henry was speechless, and the look in Malik's father's eyes said it all. He knew. He had heard everything, and now Henry was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. Henry stood frozen, his mouth slightly open as Malik's father extended a hand toward him. The grip was firm, confident, powerful. "Nice to meet you," the man said, his voice smooth but laced with something deeper, something knowing. "I'm Darius Carter." Henry's stomach twisted. Darius Carter. That name rang in his ears like a deafening bell. This wasn't just any successful black businessman. This was the Darius Carter. A self-made billionaire, owner of multiple companies, and a man who had built his empire from the ground up. A man who now stood before him, fully aware of the racist words Henry had spat at his son just days ago. Claire had told Henry once about a Mr. Carter, someone well-respected, someone her husband had worked with in the past. But Henry had never imagined this was who she meant. Malik crossed his arms, his smirk barely concealed. "So, Grandpa Henry, you had some thoughts about my family the other day. Something about my place." Ethan swallowed hard, glancing at his grandfather. He had never seen him this quiet before. Henry's face burned. His hands trembled slightly at his sides, but his pride wouldn't let him back down, not yet. He forced a tight smile. "Well now, I just didn't expect." Darius's expression didn't change. He could see right through Henry's weak attempt at saving face. "Didn't expect what?" Henry cleared his throat. "I didn't expect Malik's father to be someone so accomplished." The silence that followed was heavy. Malik raised an eyebrow. "So if my dad wasn't rich, would I still not be good enough to be Ethan's friend?" Henry felt sweat bead at his temple. "That's not what I—" Darius held up a hand, cutting him off. His voice remained calm, but there was an unmistakable edge. "Let's cut to the chase, Henry. I know who you are. I know what you think of my son. And I know the kind of world you come from, the kind where you believe that the color of someone's skin decides their worth." Henry's lips pressed into a thin line. "Now, hold on just a minute." "No," Darius interrupted smoothly, stepping closer. "You hold on a minute. Let me tell you something about the real world you are so eager to lecture my son about." Henry stiffened. Darius gestured around. This home? The success I've built? It wasn't handed to me. It wasn't given as some handout. I earned every bit of it through hard work, despite men like you telling me I'd never make it." His voice dropped lower, firmer. "You spent years believing that people like me had a place beneath you. But tell me, Henry, who's standing in whose house right now?" Henry felt his face go hot. Ethan glanced at his grandfather, his stomach twisting. He had never seen Henry look so small. Darius tilted his head slightly, his gaze never leaving Henry's. "If my son was just an ordinary kid from an average family, would he still deserve the same respect? Or does it only count because he comes from money?" Henry opened his mouth, but no words came out. Malik took a step forward, his voice cutting through the silence. "See, Grandpa Henry, that's the difference between us. I don't need my dad's success to prove my worth." He crossed his arms. "I already knew it." Ethan grinned. His best friend had won, without even trying. Henry, for the first time in his life, had no argument to make, no smug comeback, because the truth was staring him in the face. He had been wrong. And the worst part, everyone in the room knew it. The silence in the room was suffocating. Henry, a man who had always believed himself to be right, who had lived his entire life with unwavering certainty about how the world worked, stood in the grand foyer of Darius Carter's home, speechless. His chest felt tight. His pride screamed at him to say something, to fight back, to find a way to twist this moment into a win. But no words came, because deep down, in a place he rarely confronted, he knew. He had lost. Ethan watched his grandfather's face closely. He could see it, the struggle, the crumbling of years of ingrained beliefs. For the first time, Henry wasn't the one in control of the conversation. Claire, standing a few feet away, folded her arms and shook her head. "Well, Dad, anything to say?" Henry's throat worked as he tried to find words. "I didn't know." Malik let out a short laugh. "Didn't know what? That a black man could be more successful than you?" Henry winced. Darius stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Here's what you should have known, Henry. My son doesn't owe you success to deserve your respect. He doesn't have to prove anything to you. His worth isn't determined by the size of this house or the money in my bank account." Henry swallowed hard. I never said it was. But you thought it," Darius countered. "The only reason you're questioning yourself right now is because I turned out to be someone you can't look down on." His eyes darkened. "And that's the problem, Henry. You don't respect people. You respect power." The words hit Henry harder than he expected, because deep down, he knew it was true. He had spent his life seeing people like Malik as beneath him. Yet here he was, standing in a house that dwarfed his own, facing a man who had surpassed everything he had ever accomplished. For the first time in his life, Henry wasn't the one looking down. He was the one being looked down upon. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Grandpa," he said quietly, "you were wrong about Malik. You were wrong about everything." Henry flinched. And that's when the real shame set in. Not because he had been proven wrong in front of everyone, but because his own grandson was ashamed of him. A lump formed in Henry's throat. His hands trembled. All his life, he had laughed at the idea of change. He had dismissed it, ridiculed it. But standing here, with the weight of his grandson's disappointment pressing down on him, he felt something foreign. Regret. Darius let the silence hang for a moment before finally sighing. "I don't expect you to change overnight, Henry. But if you can't respect my son for who he is, then maybe it's time you ask yourself if you're really the man you think you are." Henry's breath hitched. Darius turned to Malik and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Come on, son. Let's not waste any more time here." Malik shot one last glance at Henry before walking away, his head held high. Ethan hesitated for a moment, staring at his grandfather, then turned and followed his best friend. Claire stayed behind for a moment, watching her father closely. "Dad," she said softly, "you can be better than this. I know you can." Henry didn't answer, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't so sure. The ride home was painfully quiet. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, arms crossed, staring out the window. Henry gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white, his mind a storm of thoughts. For the first time in his life, he felt small. He had spent decades believing he understood the world, that he knew how things should be, but today had shattered that illusion. Darius Carter wasn't some exception. He was proof that Henry had been wrong all along. But worse than that, it was the look in Ethan's eyes. Not anger, not frustration. Disappointment. That cut deeper than anything Darius had said. Henry let out a heavy sigh. "Ethan." The boy didn't answer. He didn't even look at him. Henry tried again. "Ethan, look, Ethan turned sharply, his voice raw. "You embarrassed me today." Henry flinched. He had expected an argument, maybe even shouting, but Ethan's voice wasn't angry. It was hurt. "I thought you were just old-fashioned," Ethan continued, his voice trembling. I thought maybe you just didn't know any better, but you chose to be like this. You chose to judge Malik before you even knew who he was. Henry opened his mouth, but Ethan shook his head. You know what's crazy? Ethan let out a bitter laugh. Malik knew. He knew you wouldn't respect him unless he had money, unless his dad was some big deal. And you proved him right. Henry's chest tightened. Do you have any idea what that feels like? Ethan's voice broke. Knowing your best friend wasn't even surprised that my own grandfather would hate him for no reason? Henry gripped the steering wheel, his throat dry. Ethan, I don't hate him. Then why? Ethan's eyes burned with emotion. Why did you treat him like he was nothing? Henry didn't have an answer. Because the truth was, he didn't even think before he spoke to Malik that day. His words had come so naturally, like second nature. But now, sitting in the silence of his car, he realized something. It wasn't second nature. It was taught, passed down, nurtured, engraved into him by the world he grew up in, and for the first time in his life, he questioned it. They pulled into the driveway, but Ethan didn't wait for the car to stop completely before unbuckling his seatbelt and throwing the door open. Ethan, Henry started, but the boy was already out, slamming the door behind him. Henry watched him storm into the house, his heart sinking. For years he had been the one looking at the world with judgment. But today, for the first time, the world had judged him, and he wasn't sure he liked what it saw. Henry sat alone in his car, the engine off, but he couldn't bring himself to go inside. His hands rested on his lap, trembling slightly. For the first time in his life, he felt the crushing weight of his own ignorance. He had lost Ethan's respect. And deep down, he knew he deserved it. His whole life, he had believed people like Malik didn't belong in the same world as him. But today, standing in the grand home of Darius Carter, he had seen undeniable proof that everything he thought he knew was wrong. Not just wrong. Poisonous. His own grandson, his flesh and blood, was ashamed of him. Henry swallowed hard and forced himself out of the car. The house was quiet when he stepped inside. Claire stood in the kitchen, her arms crossed. The look she gave him said everything. "Dad," she said, her voice sharp. "Fix this." Henry nodded weakly. He wasn't sure how. He just knew he had to. He found Ethan in his room, sitting on his bed with his arms crossed. He didn't even look up when Henry entered. For a long moment, Henry just stood there, staring at his grandson. Then, for the first time in his life, he admitted defeat. "I was wrong," he said quietly. Ethan's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "What?" Henry let out a shaky breath. "I was wrong," he repeated, louder this time. "About Malik, about everything. I let myself believe things that weren't true. I judged him before I even knew him, and that was wrong." Ethan blinked, his arms slowly uncrossing. "So, you're admitting it?" Henry nodded. "Kid, I am." He ran a hand through his thinning hair. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I don't want you to be ashamed of me." His voice cracked slightly. That hurt more than anything today. Ethan studied his grandfather carefully. For the first time, he saw something he had never seen in Henry before. Remorse. "Do you really mean it?" Ethan asked cautiously. Henry let out a shaky laugh. "Kid, I've never been more sure of anything in my life." He sighed, rubbing his face. "I don't want to be the man I was today. I don't want to be someone who makes a good kid like Malik feel small." Ethan's chest tightened. "So, what are you going to do about it?" Henry thought for a long moment. Then he straightened his shoulders. "I'm going to apologize." Ethan's eyes widened. "To Malik?" Henry nodded. "And to his dad?" His voice was firm, no hesitation. "I need to own up to what I did. Not just to you, not just to Malik, but to myself." For the first time since they left Malik's house, Ethan smiled. "Good," he said, "because Malik deserves that." Henry chuckled. "Yeah, I think I do too." The next day, Henry found himself standing in front of the Carter home once again. But this time, he wasn't there to scoff. He wasn't there to judge. He was there to listen. And as the door opened and he looked into the eyes of the man he had once thought himself superior to, Henry did something he had never done before. He bowed his head slightly. And he humbled himself. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I owe you, and your son, an apology, and for the first time in his life." Henry took his first real step toward change.